CBS News Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto, joins us now. Anthony, thank you for your time. So, to what extent do you think Americans think voter fraud is a big issue that's facing the country right now?
Hey there, Muga, and that's the right question, because we want to look at the larger context here. We've been following this in polling for years, and especially since 2020. The bottom line is that the majority of Americans think that voter fraud, if it occurs, is in isolated incidents and not necessarily widespread. But there's a second beat to that, and that is the inescapable differences that we've seen among partisans, which is to say, the Republicans, the president's base, has been much more receptive to what you might say his allegations, his claims that there are more widespread instances of fraud. In fact, much of this has happened since 2020. And if I show you the graphic that I think is coming up on your screen, you're going to see this difference between the large number, overwhelming number of Republicans who, after 2024, thought, as Americans did, that Donald Trump was the legitimate winner of the 24 election. But compare that to after 2020, when just under a quarter of Republicans felt that Joe Biden had been the legitimate winner. And in fact, they continued to express that view throughout Joe Biden's presidency. So again, very much on the Republican base here, these views, and also very much still stemming out of 2020, Mugo.
And Anthony, I'm not sure if you just touched on that, because this seems very similar to my next question for you. But when it all comes down to it, what do most Americans actually believe happened in the 2020 election? And what are you watching for right now?
Well, you can unpack that a little bit more in this sense. One is you look at some of the elements that the president has stressed. Mail balloting, and in particular, and again, you see partisan differences where more likely Republicans say that there is fraud in mail balloting specifically as opposed to in person. There is, however, and if I get away from the partisan differences for a minute, there is the widespread view that there ought to be voter ID. Now, there's other specifics in the SAVE Act that, might complicate that. But in terms of broad opinion, you do see support for that. Having said that, Mugo, as you look forward then to 2026, to the midterms here, you see some, but not necessarily very, amounts of confidence in the idea that people's votes will be counted correctly, and that is shared by Democrats and Republicans. But I should point out, for different reasons. For Republicans, it's the elements that I just talked about, the suspicion of widespread fraud. For Democrats, it's often about ballot access and the concerns on their part that they won't be able, whether it's by mail ballot or access to a ballot, be able to complete the process. So that word fraud there has a lot of different meanings depending on who you talk to, and that is the larger context, Mugo.
Anthony Salvanto, you always help us really see the big picture with those numbers. Thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.